My girlfriend said during a ferry ride in Sydney. Maybe our paths were never meant to stay parallel forever. I thanked her for the clarity, finished my contract abroad, and later she heard my name mentioned at an event neither of us expected. Maybe our paths were never meant to stay parallel forever. She said it quietly, looking out at the water, like she was reading a line from a book she'd already finished. Not shouting, not crying, just calm. The kind of calm that takes months to build when a person has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to deliver it. The ferry cut through the harbor, the opera house lit up behind us like a postcard nobody asked for. I remember thinking, of all the places to have this conversation, she chose here. I remember thinking, she always had a sense of theater. And I remember thinking, that sentence doesn't sound like something a person says when they're sad. It sounds like something a person says when they're relieved. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I looked at her for a long moment, long enough to make sure I was reading the situation correctly. Then I said, "Thank you for the clarity." She blinked. I think she expected more from me. Maybe a fight. Maybe begging. Maybe at least a question. But I had nothing left to offer her that she hadn't already made clear she didn't want. So I looked back at the water. And we finished the ferry ride in silence. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 29 years old. I had been with Cassandra for 3 years, 2 months, and somewhere around 12 days, though I stopped counting the moment she spoke those words. I was in Sydney on a 14-month engineering contract with a firm that had brought me out from Bristol. She had moved over 8 months in, when things between us were still warm enough to make that kind of sacrifice feel romantic. That's all the context you need. The ferry docked at Circular Quay just after 9 in the evening. We walked off together, which felt absurd given what had just been said. But that's the thing about real breakups. Nobody gives you a script for the logistics afterward. Do you share a cab? Do you pretend the last 15 minutes didn't happen? Do you hug? She stopped on the pavement and turned to me. Her eyes were searching my face for something. Anger maybe, or hurt, or the version of me that would make this feel like it meant something. "Are you okay?" she asked. And I understood in that moment that her asking me that question was not kindness. It was the final check. She needed to know if I was going to fall apart, because if I was, she'd have to stay and manage it. "I'm fine," I said. "You sure?" "Yeah." She nodded slowly, like she was trying to decide if she believed me. "Okay," she finally said. And she walked toward the taxi rank. I watched her go. She didn't look back. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the apartment I'd been renting since August, and I put my hands in my jacket pockets, and I kept walking until the lights of the harbor were behind me. Let me back up. Not far, just enough to explain what the ferry ride was supposed to be. We had been struggling for about 4 months before that night. Not in a dramatic, explosive way. More like a slow, steady leak in a tire, the kind you don't notice until you're already riding on the rim. She had moved to Sydney because of me. She'd left a good job in Bristol, a solid circle of friends, a flat she actually loved. She'd done it because I'd asked her to, because I'd said 14 months wasn't that long, because I'd said we'd make it work. And she'd come. And for the first few months, it genuinely felt like we were making it work. We explored the city together on weekends. She found freelance work quickly. She was a graphic designer, talented enough that geography was mostly irrelevant. We cooked dinner together in that too-small kitchen on Thursday nights. We had a good thing. And then, somewhere around month 5 or 6, I started noticing that she was tired. Not tired like jet-lagged. Tired like a person who has been performing enthusiasm for a situation they're no longer sure they chose for the right reasons. She'd go quiet at dinner. She'd scroll her phone when we were watching something. She'd laugh a beat too late at things I said, like she was catching up from a distance. I noticed. I just didn't know how to bring it up without making it worse. So I didn't. And she didn't. And we just lived side by side in that carefully polite way that couples do when they're both too scared of what the honest conversation might cost them. The ferry ride had been my idea. I thought it might help. A nice evening out, some fresh air, the harbor view. Something to cut through the quiet tension that had moved in with us like an uninvited flatmate. She'd agreed. She'd worn that blue coat I always liked. And for the first 20 minutes, it had actually felt okay. We talked about a film we'd watched the previous week. She told me something funny that had happened on a call with a client. I pointed out a boat that looked unnecessarily large. It felt almost normal. And then she went quiet. And she looked out at the water. And she said the thing she said. I don't know when she decided. That's the part that stayed with me the longest. Not the breakup itself. but the question of when she'd crossed from uncertainty into decision. Because there's a long road between, "I'm not sure about this," and "maybe our paths were never meant to stay parallel forever." That second sentence requires conviction. It requires the kind of internal processing that happens over days or weeks, the quiet negotiations a person has with themselves when they're working up to something. And she'd had all of that without me noticing. Or maybe I'd noticed and told myself it was something else. The night she left, I sat on the couch in that apartment for about an hour just thinking. Not crying, not angry, just thinking. I thought about Bristol, about the flat we'd shared there before I got the contract offer. I thought about the evening she'd stood in the kitchen and said she was terrified of long distance, terrified that the distance would make me forget what we had. I thought about how I'd told her that wouldn't happen. I thought about how neither of us had been right about the other. Then I got up, made a cup of tea, and went to bed. The next 6 months were quiet. Cassandra found a flight back to the UK within 2 weeks. We didn't do the slow fade or the extended emotional detox that some couples attempt after a split. We had one brief, functional phone call where we sorted out the practical things, who had what, whether there was anything she needed shipped back, that kind of thing. She was polite. I was polite. It felt like closing a bank account with a branch you'd been a customer at for a long time. Professional. Courteous. Final. After she left, I threw myself into the contract. Not as a distraction, or not only as a distraction, but because the work was genuinely demanding and there was real satisfaction in focusing on something I was actually good at. I was working on a large-scale infrastructure project, the kind that requires precision and patience and the willingness to chase down tiny inconsistencies before they become expensive problems. I was good at that, better than I sometimes gave myself credit for. My project lead, a sharp, permanently caffeinated man named Owen, told me 3 months in that I was one of the most methodical engineers he'd worked with. I remember filing that away somewhere useful. I worked long hours. I explored Sydney on my own, which turned out to be its own kind of education. I found a coffee place in Surrey Hills that I went to every Saturday morning. I started running along the harbor on weekends. I called my younger brother back in Bristol on Sunday evenings. Life, in other words, continued, which is either obvious or worth saying, depending on where you are when you read it. There was one evening, about 2 months after she'd gone, when I was walking back from the office and I passed the ferry terminal at Circular Quay. I stood there for a minute, not in a brooding, cinematic way. More just, I stopped. I looked at the terminal. I thought about that night. And then I thought something I hadn't quite let myself think before. I thought, she wasn't wrong. Not about us not being right for each other. I wasn't sure about that yet. But about the way she'd said it. She hadn't been cruel. She hadn't manufactured a dramatic exit. She'd just said a true thing in a quiet voice on a ferry, and then gone home and packed her bags. There was something almost honest about that, even if it had blindsided me. I stood there for another minute. Then I went home, reheated leftovers, and watched 30 minutes of a documentary about deep-sea fish before falling asleep on the couch. The contract ended in early March. I flew back to Bristol on a Tuesday, which feels like the kind of detail that shouldn't matter, but somehow does. My brother picked me up from the airport. He asked how I was. I said good. He gave me the look that younger siblings have perfected across all of human history. The look that means I know you're performing fine, and I'm going to pretend to believe you until you're ready to talk. I appreciated it. We drove back to his flat in Clifton, where I'd be staying for a few weeks before figuring out my next move professionally. He'd made pasta. We ate it watching football with the sound low. It was the most comfortable I'd felt in months. I should tell you something about the months before Sydney, because it matters to the rest of this. Cassandra and I had not been in our first relationship when we met. Both of us had histories. Mine was complicated, hers less so, or at least that was the impression she gave. We met at a work event in London about 6 months before I moved back to Bristol. She was there with a client of hers. I was there because my firm had sent 3 of us. We talked near the drinks table for about 40 minutes, and then she gave me her number without me asking for it, which I still think is one of the more attractive things a person can do. We were casual for the first few months. Then it became something more. And then I got the contract offer, and we had the conversation about what that meant, and she said the thing about being terrified of long distance. And I said, come with me. And she did. What I didn't tell her until much later, and this is the part I've thought about since, was that I'd had my own doubt before I asked her. Not about her. About us. About the specific shape of us. We were good together in the easy moments, but I noticed that we were not particularly good at navigating the hard ones. Not in a screaming way. More in the way that when things got tense, we both retreated. She'd go quiet. I'd go into my head. And we'd circle each other for days without actually addressing whatever had broken the surface. I'd seen that pattern, and I'd asked her to come anyway. Which means that part of what happened on that ferry was something I'd built the conditions for. I've sat with that. Back in Bristol, I spent a few weeks decompressing and then started putting out feelers about my next contract. I had a reputation in the industry that I'd spent years cultivating carefully, and coming back from a successful 14 months abroad had only strengthened it. Within 6 weeks, I had 2 offers on the table. One was domestic, based out of Edinburgh. The other was in Frankfurt, 18 months. I took Frankfurt. Not to run away, I want to be clear about that. I took it because it was the better project, technically more interesting, better compensation, and Frankfurt is an underrated city that I'd always wanted to spend real time in. My brother gave me the look again. You sure? He said. It's a good contract, I said. I know it's a good contract, he said. I laughed. He let it go. Frankfurt turned out to be exactly what I needed, though I wouldn't have used that word at the time because it sounds too much like therapy speak for my taste. What I mean is, I arrived knowing nobody, in a city where I had no history, with a job that demanded my full attention, and 6 months and I realized I had stopped thinking about the ferry. Not because it didn't matter, but because life had moved over it like water over a stone. I made friends at work. A colleague named Felix, a structural engineer from Munich with a dry sense of humor and an encyclopedic knowledge of German beer, became someone I genuinely liked spending time with. There was a woman named Adele, not the singer, which she was extremely tired of clarifying, who ran the project coordination team and who had an absolutely zero-tolerance policy for professional mediocrity that I found deeply refreshing. There was the city itself, efficient and a little austere and full of surprisingly good food if you knew where to look. I started actually enjoying my weekends again. Not the performed enjoyment of someone trying to convince themselves they're fine. Real enjoyment. The kind where you're sitting in a beer garden at noon on a Saturday and you realize you haven't thought about anything difficult in 3 hours. It was at the end of my first year in Frankfurt that the event happened. I need to set this up correctly, because the way I experienced it was not dramatic in the moment. The drama came later, when I understood what it had meant. There was an international infrastructure summit, one of those industry events where firms from across Europe send representatives to shake hands, present work, drink bad wine, and pretend the networking isn't the whole point. My firm sent me as one of 3 presenting engineers. It was in Zurich. 2 days, a conference center near the lake, the kind of event that has a very official program and a very unofficial drinks at the hotel bar component that everyone considers the real conference. I presented on the second morning. The session went well. I'd prepared thoroughly. The questions from the floor were engaged and specific rather than performative, and Owen, who'd come over from Sydney for the event because his firm was also presenting, found me afterward and said, "That was as good as I've seen you." High praise from Owen, who dispensed compliments like he was charged per word. After the formal sessions ended on the second afternoon, there was a networking reception in the conference center's main atrium. Drinks, small food, the ambient noise of several hundred engineers pretending to be comfortable at cocktail parties. I was standing with Felix and 2 colleagues from another firm, talking about a project in Rotterdam that was generating a lot of industry discussion when I heard it. Not my name. Not yet. I heard her laugh. Now, I want to be careful here, because what I'm describing sounds like something from a film, and I am aware of that. But this is what happened. There was a laugh, familiar in texture, a particular cadence, and I turned, almost involuntarily, toward the sound. Across the atrium, maybe 15 meters away, Cassandra was standing with a group of 4 people. She was animated, gesturing as she talked. That blue coat she always liked replaced by a dark blazer. She looked well. She looked exactly like herself. She had not seen me. I turned back to the conversation I'd been having. Felix was saying something about the Rotterdam project. I made an appropriate response. I did not look back across the room for several minutes. When I did, she was still in conversation with the same group. One of the men in her group, older, broad-shouldered, clearly someone in a senior position based on the way the others were angled toward him, was talking now, and Cassandra was listening. I thought, of course she's here. She'd moved into architectural design work around the time we started dating. Events like this overlap. Industries press against each other. Of course, I did not go over. I thought about it. I decided against it. Not out of bitterness or avoidance. Genuinely, I had no hostility toward her. I just didn't see the point of manufacturing an encounter. We hadn't spoken in well over a year. We had been polite and final. Walking over to say hello at a drinks reception would have felt like reopening something that had closed cleanly, and for no reason other than the mild discomfort of having noticed each other. So I didn't go over. I stayed where I was, talked to Felix and the others, and eventually moved to a different part of the atrium to speak with someone I'd been introduced to earlier. I thought, with some satisfaction, that I'd managed the whole thing with a reasonable amount of emotional maturity. I thought, wrongly, that the evening was finished. About 40 minutes later, I was in a smaller conversation, just two of us, a project manager from a Copenhagen firm named Henrik, discussing something about material specification standards, when a woman I didn't know approached us. She introduced herself as Vivian. She was in communications for one of the larger firms presenting at the summit. She had clearly had a more enthusiastic relationship with the wine than Henrik and I had. She was friendly and warm and very good at professional small talk. She joined our conversation easily. About 10 minutes in, something shifted. I'm not sure exactly how it came up. She was talking about something related to a project she'd been working on, and she mentioned a name. She mentioned a colleague, a specific project in Sydney. And then she said, actually, there was this engineer who worked on something adjacent. I can't remember the firm's name, but he was extraordinary, the kind of person you remember because the precision of the work was just different. Henrik asked his name. She said she couldn't quite recall. It had been a few years. And then she turned to me and said, actually, you might know him. You work in infrastructure. He was based out of Bristol originally, I think. And she said my name, not my first name, my full name, first and last, with total, easy confidence. She said, I think he went back to Europe. Do you know him? I said, that's me. She blinked, and then she laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh, and said, you're joking. I showed her my conference badge. She looked at it, looked at me, and said something like, the world is genuinely absurd sometimes. Henrik found this very funny. I was still processing the oddness of hearing your own name like that, dropped into a conversation you're already part of, aimed at you, about you, without the person realizing. It's a strange sensation, like hearing a recording of your own voice. What I didn't know, in that moment, was that Cassandra was close. I found this out about 6 minutes later. Vivian had asked me something about the Sydney project. I'd answered, and the three of us had continued talking. And then I noticed Cassandra. She was approaching from my left, at a slight angle, clearly moving toward Vivian's direction. They evidently knew each other. She saw Vivian first. She was already smiling, already forming a greeting. Then she registered Henrik. Then she registered me. The smile didn't disappear, but it changed. It recalibrated. Her eyes went through something, a fast, private sequence of adjustments. And then she completed the walk, and she said hi, in a voice that was impressively even. Hi, I said. I didn't know you were here, she said. I'm presenting, I said. You? Client work, she said. Some crossover with the architecture side. Of course, I said. A pause. Vivian, who had no idea what was happening, said brightly, do you two know each other? We do, Cassandra said. Old colleagues? Vivian asked. We dated, Cassandra said. Simply, like pulling off a plaster. Vivian's expression shifted into that specific face people make when they realize they have landed in the middle of something they didn't sign up for. Well, she said. It was a long time ago, Cassandra added. A few years, I agreed. Henrik, to his credit, chose this exact moment to spot someone he needed to speak with across the room. He excused himself with impressive speed. It was just the three of us for a moment. Then Vivian said something about needing to check on a colleague, which we both understood for exactly what it was, and then she was gone too. And it was just Cassandra and me, standing in the middle of a networking reception in Zurich, in a situation that neither of us had planned for or wanted. She looked at me. I looked at her. You look well, she said. You too, I said. And I meant it honestly, without subtext. She glanced toward the window, toward the lake visible through the glass. Frankfurt? She said, reading my badge. Year and a half, I said. Good project. She nodded. I heard you finished the Sydney contract. Through who? I asked. Not defensively, genuinely curious. Owen, she said. I ran into him at something in London a while back. He said you'd done exceptional work. Owen exaggerates, I said. He really doesn't, she said. Another pause. The ambient noise of the reception moved around us. Someone laughed loudly nearby. Were you going to come over? She asked. No, I said. Honestly. She absorbed that. I saw you earlier, she said. I know. I thought you might, she started. Stopped. I wasn't sure what the point would be, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Not hurt, not offended. More like she was trying to identify something she couldn't quite name. Fair enough, she finally said. We talked for about 20 minutes, standing slightly apart, drinks in hand, occasionally watching the room around us rather than looking directly at each other. It was not hostile. It was not warm in the way that things had once been warm. It was something else, something that exists between two people who shared something real and then didn't, and have both since built lives that no longer include the other. Civil, perhaps even adult, in the proper sense of the word. She told me she had moved back to London after Bristol. New flat, new studio, better clients. Things were going well. I told her about Frankfurt, about the project, about planning to stay in Europe for a while. She said that sounded like me. I asked what she meant. She said, "You always move toward the next thing better than most people." I didn't know if that was a compliment or a careful observation. I said, "You always made better exits than most people." She looked at me then, really looked. Was that cruel? I asked. No, she said. After a moment. No, it wasn't. And then she said something that I've turned over several times since. She said, "I heard your name just now. Before I came over. Vivian was talking and I heard your name and I thought, I must be mistaken. I thought my brain was filling something and that wasn't there." "It was there," I said. "Yes," she said. She looked down at her drink. "Strange evening," she said. "Strange evening," I agreed. A long pause. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Were you angry?" "After Sydney." I thought about it. "Not in the way you might think," I said. "Not at you." "At the situation?" "At myself," I said. "For not having the conversation earlier. For letting us get to that point." She was quiet. "I should have said something sooner," she said. She stopped. Started again. "I'd been deciding for about 2 months. And I kept not saying it because I thought maybe something would shift." "Something did shift," I said. "Just not in the direction you needed." She almost smiled. "No," she said. "Not in the direction I needed." Another pause. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said. "I know," I said. And I did know. That had never been in question. We talked a little longer. About the industry, about mutual acquaintances, about nothing particularly significant. The kind of conversation that two people have when they are filling in the space between something that already happened and a goodbye that is still coming. Eventually, she said she should get back to her colleagues. I said, of course. She looked at me for a moment. That same look as on the ferry dock, searching my face for something. But this time I think she found it. Whatever she was looking for. Because the searching stopped, and she just looked at me, and she said, "I hope Frankfurt is everything you want it to be." "It's getting there," I said. She nodded. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too, Cassandra." She turned. She walked back toward her group. This time I watched her go for a longer moment than I had at Circular Quay. And then I turned away first. I stood at the window for a few minutes after that, looking out at the lake. Zurich at night is a very composed kind of beautiful, precise and lit and still. I thought about what she'd said, about hearing my name before she came over, about thinking her brain was filling something and that wasn't there. There's something interesting about that, the way the mind reaches for what it half expects, the way familiarity persists in the nervous system long after the person attached to it has moved on. She'd heard my name and thought, impossible. And then she'd walked over and found the impossible true. And she'd managed it with exactly the poise and composure that I had always, even at the worst of it, genuinely admired about her. I thought, we were not wrong about each other. We were just wrong about timing, about what we each needed and when, about the gap between what a relationship looks like from the outside and what it costs the people inside it. None of that makes the ferry less real. None of that changes the fact that she decided, and she was right to decide, and the clarity she gave me on that harbor was, I could finally say this without the accompanying sting, a gift. Not a kind one, but a real one. Felix found me at the window. "You look like you're writing poetry," he said. "Just thinking," I said. "About the presentation?" "Because it went fine, you know. Better than fine." "Not about the presentation." He stood next to me. He looked out at the lake. He'd met Cassandra once, briefly, when she'd come through Frankfurt on a client visit and we'd all ended up having dinner together. He didn't ask, but I think he had a reasonable idea. "Good event," he said after a while. "Yeah," I said. "Drink," he said. "Yeah," I said. And we went back to the bar, and the evening moved on, and the summit ended the next morning, and I flew back to Frankfurt on a Thursday afternoon. The thing about that conversation in Zurich is that it didn't break anything open. It didn't unravel me. It didn't send me spiraling back into something I'd already moved through. If anything, it closed something. Not dramatically. More like the last page of a book you've been reading for a long time. Not a shocking ending. Not a cliffhanger. Just the right sequence of words arriving in the right order until there aren't any more to read. I got back to my flat in Frankfurt, made tea, unpacked my bag, and sat for a while before bed. I thought about the ferry. I thought about the atrium. I thought about the specific, accidental theater of hearing your own name from a stranger and turning around to find the person from your past standing 20 feet away. I thought about what she'd said. Maybe our paths were never meant to stay parallel forever. I'd thanked her for the clarity. And the clarity, I realized now, had been real. Not comfortable, not painless, but real in the way that useful things are real. The kind of thing you don't appreciate until it's far enough behind you that you can see its shape. Here's what I know now that I didn't know on that ferry. I had been building something in Bristol that I was not sure I believed in. Not because of anything wrong with her, but because I had arrived at that relationship at a moment when I wanted stability more than I wanted honesty, when I was confusing comfort with connection, when I was so focused on not being alone that I wasn't asking the harder question of whether this was the right version of not being alone. And she had done the same thing, in her own way. She'd moved to Sydney for reasons that included me, but weren't only me. She wanted the adventure of it. She wanted to know if she could do it. She wanted something to be different. And when Sydney didn't turn out to be the transformation she'd hoped for, she looked at us and realized that the problem wasn't geography. The problem was that we were two people who cared about each other and had decided that caring was enough, when it was actually only the beginning of a longer set of questions. She asked those questions, on a harbor, in the dark, with the city lit up around us. And I, to my own credit, accepted the answers. I went back to Bristol at the end of the Frankfurt contract. Not permanently. I had another offer waiting, this time domestic, based out of London. A project I was genuinely excited about. A team I'd heard good things about. I found a flat in East London. Nothing remarkable, just a place that was mine. My brother came down the first weekend, and we went to a pub that had no ambitions above being a pub, which I respected enormously. He asked about Frankfurt. I told him it had been good. He asked about the summit. I told him about presenting, about Owen turning up, about the weird moment with Vivian and the name. I didn't tell him about Cassandra, not because it was painful, just because some stories don't need to be told in full to every person who matters to you. Some of them are just yours. He asked if I was happy. I thought about it genuinely before answering. Yeah, I said. I actually think I am. He looked at me. Not the look. A different one. The one that means, I believe you. Good, he said, and picked up his pint. I've thought about what it would mean if I told this story differently. If I told it as a story about a woman who broke my heart on a ferry, and then I became successful and she regretted it. Because that version exists, in a way. She did break it off on a ferry. I did well afterward. She did hear my name mentioned at an event. But the rest of it, the regret, the comeuppance, the satisfying narrative where her loss is the point, that's not what happened. What happened is that two people made decisions, and the decisions turned out to be correct for both of them, even though one of them didn't feel like it at the time. What happened is that we bumped into each other in an atrium in Zurich and spoke like adults and said some honest things, and then went back to our respective lives. What happened is that the ferry wasn't a betrayal. It was a door, and I walked through it. Not gracefully, not without bruises, but I walked through. And on the other side was Frankfurt, and a good project, and Felix in a beer garden, and a summit in Zurich, and a flat in East London, and a pub with no ambitions above being a pub, and my brother saying I believe you. And that's not a consolation prize. That's just life. That's just what life looks like when you let someone give you clarity instead of fighting to take it back. One last thing. A few months into the London project, I received an email. It was from Cassandra. Short, professional in tone. She was working with a firm that was adjacent to the project I was on, and she'd seen my name on a document that had crossed her desk. She wasn't sure if reaching out was appropriate, but she thought the work I'd been doing looked exceptional. She said she hoped I was well. She said she was, if I was curious. I read it twice. I sat with it for about a day. Then I wrote back. Short, equally professional. I said thank you. I said the project was going well. I said I hoped her work was going well too. I said I was glad she was doing fine. And then I said at the end, I hope the paths are going somewhere good. She replied with a single line. I think they are. I closed the email. I went back to work. And the harbor in Sydney was just a harbor. And the ferry was just a ferry. And the clarity was just the clarity. Which is exactly what she said it was.